looking further into the foundational beliefs of Islam and then getting into the Sunni Shia split and the Umayyads and then the Abbasids, we're going to start with the five pillars of Islam. The first pillar of Islam is that, so these five pillars of Islam are the foundational beliefs of Islam. They're shared by both Sunnis and Shias and also Sufis. So every Muslim believes in these five pillars. The first pillar is that Allah is the only God. Again, that strong monotheism, and Muhammad is his prophet. Again, notice he's not the son of God. He's not deified in any way, shape, or form. All of the deification goes to Allah. This is they Muslims also believe that God should not be depicted in pictures, and so this is a picture so that you're not worshiping idols. Remember that destruction of the idols right at the very beginning. It's very important. This is the calligraphy of Allah. You pray 5 times a day, and when you pray, first of all, you go through this ritual washing. So you're like washing your hands, washing your feet, and then you face the Kaaba or Mecca. You fast during Ramadan, both water or liquid and food during daylight hours. So you don't break the fast. You break the fast, you're eating before daylight and after daylight. And Ramadan is a lunar month, so it moves around on the calendar, on our calendar. You give alms to the poor. 2% of your income goes directly to the poor. In a caliphate, a lot of times this was filtered through a mosque, and then the mosque would have facilities for the poor, like free kitchens and shelter and clothing and all that stuff. And then once in your life, a faithful Muslim is supposed to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. The last thing I want to say about these foundational beliefs is that we as scholars and Muslims have more knowledge about Muhammad than we as historians or as believers do of any other person. So, for example, I'm Presbyterian. It's impossible for me to know as much as Muslims do about Muhammad, about, for example, Jesus, because there's just not a very large historical record on Jesus, or in comparison, it's not as large. Similarly, I know a lot more about Jesus than Buddhists do about Siddhartha Gautama, because again, there's just not as much of a historical record on him. So that plays a big role in Muhammad and the way Muhammad is depicted in Islam. This is the mosque that contains the Kaaba in Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia. So there it is. And this is during the holy month of Ramadan, I believe. Other important pieces of Islam. First is jihad. So jihad can mean basically two things. It can mean struggle, or it can mean holy war. So if it's a struggle, you're struggling against like a vice. For example, you're not supposed to drink alcohol if you're a practicing Muslim. So you might be struggling against your desire or your habits of having a beer. Or you might be struggling against ignorance. For example, ignorance of Islam or ignorance of your own faith. You can also have a holy war, which would be against non-believers who threaten Islam. So when we think about jihad, typically we're thinking about this or typically in the media, this is the jihad that is depicted. It's not the individual or personalized struggle. It's the holy war against non-believers threatening Islam. And for extremists, a non-believer can be anyone who doesn't practice Islam like you. Also, Sharia law. Sharia law is a law code. It's Islamic law. It's based on the Quran, the book about Muhammad's life, basically, which is the Hadith, and then logical schools of analysis. It extends beyond what Muhammad commented on in those books. So it's, I guess you could say it's speculative. So if Muhammad, for example, didn't talk about, one thing, the lawmakers would speculate as to what would be the beliefs on that thing. And you have to remember that this is culturally, the culture is a big part of that, culturally relevant. So as Islam expands, Sharia is being written. Sharia, oftentimes we talk about Sharia with women as the place of women, as we're going to see at the end of this recording, but also Sharia covers business and business practices, and it actually protects merchants and traders. It covers healthcare. It covers treatment of the poor. It covers fair practices for minorities. For minority populations, for example, religious minorities, it covers a lot of different things, not just the treatment of women, which is what it's pretty much reduced to in our culture today in America. All right, so the expansion of Islam. The first trusted person to lead the Ummah, the community of believers, was Abu Bakr. Bakr just means great. So he was the first caliph. This is, if you look this up, he's also, that name is also taken by the leader of ISIS, or IS. So if you look him up on the internet, you're going to find just a bunch of pictures from IS. He really focused on expansion, again, expanding through all this kind of pinky looking stuff. And during that time period came into contact with both Mediterranean and Persian, or I guess Anatolian and Persian culture, both of which were a little bit more conservative, especially in terms of women. But he experienced a lot of political issues, especially around caliph selection. The Sunni thought that, and this still think today, that a believer can be caliph. Whereas the Shia, or the Shiite, believe that it needs to be from the bloodline. The leader of Islam should be from the bloodline of Muhammad. And the fourth caliph that was elected by the Ummah was a Shia, and that caliph, along with his followers, were slaughtered at their victory dinner, basically, by the Sunni, who wanted a different leader. Because the caliph is both a political and religious figure, it's a very big deal when that caliph is selected. And that, I think, goes a little bit of the way towards explaining why that was such a violent time. So the first dynasty to come along after that fourth caliph was killed, was an Arab dynasty. Their capital was in Damascus, which is in modern-day Syria. You probably hear about that in the news. They were very in favor of Arabs. So they, as Islam expanded and conquered non-Arab people, they kept picking Arab people for their military aristocracy and for the government. And that led to a lot of tensions, especially with people who were of Persian descent, and of other minority descent. But they did spread this idea of the House of Islam. They spread it to people who were non-Arab. And then people who were within their empire who didn't practice Islam could pay a tax called a jizya to continue practicing their religion. So the jizya is a tax for non-Muslims. So it's not a tax for non-Muslims, it's paid for by non-Muslims, okay? But it was fairly tolerant for its day. I mean, you got to remember in Europe that people were being killed over their different religious beliefs. And that's not to say that that never happened in the Umayyad dynasty, but it was less often of an occurrence. The Umayyads conquered Jerusalem, and they built the Dome of the Rock, which is sacred to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, because it's this stone which is believed where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son and then did not, although they differ on which son was going to be sacrificed. You can see where it's placed near the Wailing Wall, and here's a picture of the facade. This is all tiling. And then this strip here, that is Quranic verse, and you can see that there. So short-lived Umayyads, and then we're going to move on to the Abbasids, which we'll get into the next